The leader squared his shoulders, forcing a grin. "Nah, no trouble," he muttered, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. His friends were watching, expecting him to do something, but for the first time, he wasn't sure what. Clint didn't move aggressively, didn't even raise his voice, yet something about him made the air feel heavier, like a storm about to break. Then, in one quick motion, Clint shifted his stance. It was subtle, but trained eyes would recognize it instantly. Balanced, controlled, ready. The leader's grin faltered. He knew fights, or at least he thought he did, but this was different. This wasn't some random old man. This was someone who had seen real action, who knew exactly what he was doing. Clint finally spoke, his voice steady. "Go home, kid." For a long second, no one moved. Then, almost as if some invisible force had drained the fight from them, the group started backing away. The leader hesitated, his pride warring with his instincts, but in the end, he gave a short nod and turned to leave. His friends followed, their earlier bravado completely gone. Just as Clint sat back down, the jogger who had been watching stepped closer. He glanced at Clint, then at the retreating group, shaking his head. That was impressive. Clint simply smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Experience," he said. The jogger chuckled, about to respond, then froze. "Wait a minute, are you?" But Clint had already stood up and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving nothing behind but an unforgettable lesson and a story that those teenagers would never forget. The jogger stood there for a moment, watching Clint disappear into the quiet streets, a smile creeping onto his face. He had just witnessed something rare, an old-school lesson taught without a single punch thrown. The group of teenagers walked off in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced with something else. Maybe it was respect, or maybe just the realization that not everyone is as weak as they assume. As they reached the edge of the park, the youngest of the group finally spoke. "Who do you think he was?" The leader didn't answer right away. He glanced back once more, as if half expecting Clint to still be there. But the bench was empty. He shook his head. "Someone we shouldn't have messed with." The night carried on, the park returning to its peaceful state. But for those who had been there, the moment lingered, proof that real strength doesn't need to shout. The sun was setting over the quiet city park when a group of rowdy teenagers spotted an old man sitting alone on a bench. With his rugged face and worn-out clothes, he didn't look like much. Just another senior enjoying the evening air. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Amused by his calm demeanor, they decided to have a little fun at his expense. Laughing and whispering among themselves, they approached, throwing insults and making jokes, thinking he was just another easy target. But this wasn't just any old man. This was Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend with years of experience playing tough guys on screen. What they didn't know was that his training wasn't just for the movies. As their taunts grew bolder, Clint slowly stood up, his sharp eyes locking onto them. In that moment, everything changed, and the bullies were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. The teenagers exchanged glances, still grinning, but something about the way Clint stood up made them hesitate. He wasn't angry, didn't yell or threaten. He just stared, calm and steady. One of the boys, trying to keep up the act, smirked and stepped closer. "What's wrong, old man? Did we scare you?" he taunted, his friends chuckling behind him. Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, he dusted off his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. The park lights flickered above them, casting long shadows as the air grew thick with an unspoken tension. The bullies had no idea they were standing in front of a man who had spent years training for fight scenes, learning from real martial artists and stunt experts. Still, Clint wasn't looking for trouble. He had seen enough of it in his lifetime. But if these kids pushed him too far, they were about to realize they had picked the wrong man to mess with. One of the teenagers, a tall boy with a cocky grin, crossed his arms and stepped even closer. "Come on, Grandpa. You look like you can barely stand straight," he said, laughing as the others joined in. Clint tilted his head slightly, studying them. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He had seen kids like this before, full of arrogance, thinking the world owed them something. He knew they weren't really tough, just lost. A younger boy in the group shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't as bold as the others, and something about Clint's steady gaze made him uneasy. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered, but his friends ignored him. They were having too much fun. Clint finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" His question wasn't a threat, but there was something about the way he said it that made even the loudest boy pause. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. The tallest boy scoffed, shaking off the sudden hesitation in the air. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said, stepping even closer. His friends laughed, some pulling out their phones, expecting to capture an easy joke at Clint's expense. They still didn't see it, the quiet confidence in his stance, the way his hands stayed loose but ready. He had been in situations far worse than this, and he knew exactly how this would play out if they pushed him too far. The younger boy, still uneasy, took a step back. "Guys, maybe we should." "Relax," the leader interrupted, rolling his eyes. "What's he gonna do?" He reached out as if to shove Clint's shoulder, but before he could make contact, Clint shifted ever so slightly. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but suddenly the air felt different. His eyes locked onto the boys, sharp and unwavering. For the first time, the laughter stopped. The cocky smirks faded, and in that moment, they realized this wasn't going to go the way they thought. The leader of the group hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. He had expected Clint to flinch, to back down, but instead, the old man remained perfectly still, his sharp gaze locked onto him like a predator sizing up its prey. The others exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence wavering. Something about this wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, a voice called out from behind them. "Hey, what's going on here?" A jogger had stopped nearby, watching the situation unfold. His presence made the group uneasy. They hadn't planned on an audience, especially not one that might interfere. Clint took a slow step forward, his presence alone enough to make the leader shift back slightly. "You looking for trouble, kid?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The leader clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. He wasn't about to back down in front of his friends. But deep down, for the first time that night, he started to wonder if he had just made a serious mistake.